Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. What does God think about interracial marriage and why is it an issue today? Now, before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. If you watch commercials, especially and television, you see more and more interracial couples, excuse me, interracial marriage, interracial families all over the place. Now that's Hollywood oversaturating the images, okay? But what is also interesting is you see a lot of people who complain about those images. A few years ago, there was a Cheerio commercial, and it was a biracial girl talking to her mother, I think white mother, about Cheerios, and people went nuts. But who were the people that went nuts? Well, and it's the same people that are really pushing back on DEI training, CRT. We can go on and on and on. Recently, Bill Maher, of course, went on his, again, racial rant about too much talking about black. So why are people so triggered by the issue of race? And I'm focusing on interracial marriage. So this is going to be part one of me breaking this down, because one of the things that we don't see is really dealing with the truth of it. Why is interracial marriage an issue today? It's because racism is still an issue today. Why is racism an issue today? Because it was never dealt with. And in some respects, it's never going to be dealt with. Why? Because racism is a heart thing, a mental thing. And so until you change the heart, you won't change the way people think, the way people feel. And even in the church of the Lord Jesus Christ, interracial marriage is still a thing. Racism is still a thing in the church of Jesus Christ. So I want to break this down, because the reason why racism, the same reason that racism is the issue in the church of Jesus Christ, is the same reason that racism is an issue in the world, in our society, in our culture. The only problem with the world, let me read this verse here, and this is what the scripture says. This is Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it says, verse 15, "But if I should be delayed, I have written so that you will know how people ought to act in God's house, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth." In other words, the church should be the example. The church should be the the church is the foundation and pillar of truth. They're just not living up to it. No other area of society than the church that racism has been more prevalent than the church of Jesus Christ. And that's a shame. So in order for us to understand why interracial marriage is an issue, because many people think that interracial marriage is a sin. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video on this pastor, and he's a black pastor, and he said that interracial marriage is a sin. So he went a step further and said that interracial marriage is a sin. Now, even though that's a black pastor, many whites feel the same way. The question is, why? Now, again, in order to understand that, we have to understand the seeds of racism. Where did it come from? So that we have to kind of go back to the origins of our nation. Actually, we got to go back even further, but the origins of our nation, because America was seeded, planted in racism. Now, if you notice, a lot of Republican and conservative are trying to erase that history. Like they attack furiously CRT, DEI training. You had one particular conservative who said that if he walked on the plane and saw a black pilot, he would be nervous. He wouldn't have confidence. Now, what's more to me blatant is the acceptance of that view. You're always going to have racist people, but he has an audience. I don't want to veer off too much because I don't want to get off into that kind of brand of racism. But I do want to talk about why he thinks the way he thinks, why his mind has been conditioned, see, to feel that way. So the same mind conditioning that people feel today about interracial marriage, about race, racism, has never changed. It's been passed down through the generations. So it's going to go back and talk about where these seeds were planted. In the founding of our nation, first of all, we have to talk about slavery. Okay? Now, most people will say, or some people will say, well, slavery has been has been around since the beginning of mankind, and that is true. Slavery, since man fell into sin, has been around. And here's a hard truth. Even the Bible regulated slavery with Israel. Now, some people try to sanitize that by saying, well, it was indentured servant. No, it wasn't. Well, there was a part of indentured servant. The indentured servant applied to fellow Hebrews owning their fellow Hebrews. Okay? And what God did was he regulated and says, okay, here's how you ought to treat your fellow Hebrew, your fellow Jew. In fact, after so many years, they were to be let go. But here is the harsh truth. When it came to non-Jew, God says, oh, you can own them. You can do whatever you want with them. You can buy, sell, whatever. But he regulated just how a fellow Israelite was to when they owned a fellow Israelite. That's the hard truth. Now, why is that there? I can't give you an answer. But that is the hard truth of the Bible. But the difference in the slavery of the world was that it wasn't based upon race. It was just based upon if you were weaker. In other words, if this nation went to war against that nation, the nation who lost, you were going to become slaves. Now, when we get to the 14th century, the seeds of racism begin to be sown because you had to define why you were doing something or justify why you were doing something. And so Europeans began to paint Africans, dark-skinned people, as inferior. You begin to see the seeds of that. They begin to say, that they're not equal to us. And that's when we come to the term racism. Because racism is one race who says, I'm superior, and they look upon another race as inferior. Now, in order to do that, they have to do what? Dehumanize the person they feel that they're superior to or feel that they are inferior. So when it came to the Atlantic slave trade, this is when this word first was applied. Because the Atlantic slave trade, unlike any other slavery in the world, targeted a specific group of people, dark-skinned people, Africans, people of color. In order to do that, then you have to say that these people are inferior. They are inferior mentally, they are inferior physically, they are inferior spiritually. And thus now we could buy them. Now they went to the continent of Africa, right? And this is where the origins of the Atlantic slave trade began. So let's talk about, for example, the argument that, well, Africans sold fellow Africans, into slavery. Now that's true. Now, usually when people make that argument, they're trying to deflect from the evil of the European colonizer buying the slaves. But it is true that it was fellow Africans. But the way we also got to look at this is, remember, African is a continent with at least 55 distinct nations. And like any other continent, one nation of people do not consider themselves the same as the other nation. So, for example, if we go to the continent of Europe, Polish people do not see themselves the same as Sweden or Irish simply because they're European or Caucasians. We know that's true because when you have Russia that is attacking right now a fellow European nation, Caucasian. But why? Two different distinct nations. The same it was with Africa. Same if you go to South America, the different nations on the continent of South America, even though they're Hispanic, they all are distinct nations. Brazilians do not see themselves the same as Venezuelans. Venezuelans do not see themselves the same as Chileans, so forth and so on. I think you get my point. So yes, the African slave trade started because Africans in one tribe said, they're not us. So yes, we're going to sell them. Same things going on every continent. But one thing you have to understand about the colonizers, though, remember, they spread the seeds of racism through their colonization. Their mentality that people of color was inferior. In fact, even from a Christian perspective, they used the Bible, better known as the curse of Ham, where one of Noah's sons was believed to be cursed. The dark-skinned ones, Ham. But of course, they don't read the Bible, and they're not interested in what the Bible really has to say about the curse of Ham, because first and foremost, it never said there was a curse of Ham. What there was a curse of, it was the curse of Canaan, one of the descendants of Ham. That was the curse, not the curse of Ham itself. But the idea was that because Ham then produced most of the dark-skinned people, he became sort of the easy scapegoat. Now back to then the colonizers. So they spread through their colonization that mentality throughout all the world. That is why even today, if you go around the world today, there's a lot of hatred towards people of color. You go to Australia, New Zealand, right? Russia, China, right? Almost anywhere you go, you see the same sentiment. England, of course, kind of started the whole colonization. You see the same kind of racism that is today. Now, why? Racism itself is that superiority targeting a very specific people of color. Now, another component of racism is the using that power, using that superiority to oppress another race. Hence slavery. Hence Jim Crow, which we'll get to later. So that was the components of defining what racism is. In other words, racism is more than just bigotry and prejudice. It is viewing a race and then using your superiority or so-called superiority and of power to oppress where you feel is inferior. That is what the Caucasian did with the African. So now we come to the Americas. Remember, because part of the colonization, the spread of colonization was they begin to what? Spread in different nations. One of the things is the newly found Americas, where people begin to come, and live, transport. You had the seeds of racism that was brought through slavery, starting with 1619. 157 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? So you had 157 years of what? Conditioning. One of the things about racism is that you have to condition the mind to think a certain way. And in the case of racism, what? I'm superior, they're not. So how else can you justify? How else can you condone? How else can you be complicit in the practice of slavery? So even if you didn't own slaves, and most Americans didn't own slaves because they didn't have the money, but they certainly benefited from, they've certainly condoned or lived with it. So for example, how would we live with it today if you know that your neighbor owned slaves? Right? You know, if your state was full of slaves, how would we live with it today? Well, we go back to, again, the conditioning, how the mind is conditioned. You know, one of the things about the N word, one of the debates about N word, should we use the N word? I'm not going to say it because I don't want to get flagged by YouTube. But it's interesting because you see a lot of African Americans today that will say, I used the N word. I know I did growing up. We used to joke and call each other N words all the time. You know, N word, please. You know, oh, N word. You know, blah blah blah. We did that. Why? We were conditioned. That's how we were conditioned to accept. That's who we were. But here is the interesting thing now, because you have people ignorantly say it's a term of endearment. Well, okay, yeah, that's an ignorant statement because the N word is a white man's word. It was never a black man's word. It was a white man's word. It was the word that they used to condition the slaves. This is what you are. You are inferior. Okay? And so that's why African Americans refer to themselves as N-word, because that's what they were called. It would be like if you came and you saw me with my children, and all I called my children was stupid, you stupid, you stupid, you stupid, you stupid. You know, eventually the children are going to start parroting the same word. You stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid. Because that's what I'm conditioning them to think. You think about a pimp. He uses the B word, right? That's all he's never going to say, you're a lovely young lady. No, you're a B word. And I think pimps are one of the vilest people on the face of the earth for that reason. So when you go back to the conditioning, the mind conditioning, right? Now we have a problem. Come 1776, you have one of the founding fathers who said these words, among many: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So who was the founding fathers? Thomas Jefferson penned those words, right? Thomas Jefferson. But there's a problem, isn't it? Because he owned slaves. He owned slaves. So how does a slave-owning man pen those great words? Think about that. How do you, how do you look at by the way, as he penned those words, there were slaves standing in the back, serving them, refreshing their drink, emptying the piss buckets, bringing food, whatever their bidding. They were slaves. He owned them. How does that happen? Now, you would be surprised that many of the founding fathers owned slaves. Okay? Let's get a list here for a moment. Look at these. This is kind of a chart of the slave owning the founding fathers. You can see one column has those who did not own slaves and those who did own slaves. And think about this: the majority of the founding fathers owned slaves. So out of the ones who didn't own slaves would be John Adams, Samuel Adams, Oliver Edwards, Ellsworth, Alexander Hamilton, in the room where it happened, Robert Payne, Thomas Paine, Roger Sherman. But now let's take a look at who owned slaves. Founding fathers: Charles Carroll, Samuel Chase, Benjamin Franklin, Button Gwyneth, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Lee, John Madison, Charles Pinckney, Benjamin Rush, Edward Rutledge, and George Washington. Owned slaves. Owned slaves while holding to the truth. We hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They own slaves. They own slaves. So how is it that they could own slaves and pen these beautiful words of slavery? And this is, by the way, what makes America the greatest hypocrites. Because unlike what a lot of people try to say with their defense of slavery, and they are, conservatives go out of their way to try to defend slavery, try to minimize the impact, the evils of slavery. And so that's why they will say, well, there was slavery all over America. Fellow Africans Africans sold their fellow Africans to slavery. And they will say all of that without saying, yeah, but the white Americans bought them from them. And remember, the white Americans, the Caucasians, the Europeans, they propped themselves up as superior. They propped themselves up as better. So, and remember, America, these were the founding fathers. America, some of them anyway, America was the land of the free. And remember, America was Christian. America was Christian, right? So not only do we hold these truths self-evident, but they're supposed to be Christian. We believe in the Christian God who saved all men. So even if you believed in the curse of Ham, were we not saved from that? Galatians 3:13 says Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangeth on the tree, that the blessings of Abraham might come on the Gentiles. So how is it today that we still think that certain racial things are intact, like interracial marriage? So to kind of go back to, how did America in 1776, that wrote the Declaration of Independence, forget about some of its citizens? You have to remember, in 1619, when they started importing slaves, some of these slaves started having children. So 157 years later, by the time that we get to 1776, there were plenty of natural born slaves, just like there were natural born citizens. Who was engrafted in 1776? Who became citizens? Naturally born citizens. Well, they forgot about the African Americans. Well, they didn't forget about them, did they? One thing is that they deliberately said it doesn't apply to these people. That's why. In order to justify that, you have to remember, so in their racism, they had to now justify their moral stance on this. So they did it with three different ways. More, but I'm just going to condense it down to three. One, laws. So despite the Constitution, despite that there were slaves at the time of 1776 who were born on this land that had inalienable rights, that had constitutional rights, they bypassed that by making laws against the people of color. And some of those laws, by the way, still exist today. They just haven't gotten around to getting them off the books. But of course, one of them is that you can own not a white person, but you can own a black person. Which, by the way, you see people make this defense that, well, you know, the white Irish were slaves. Yeah, but there was never one law ever passed and enacted against any European. Okay? Those laws were enacted against the people of color. Thus, remember we said that racism targeted a specific group. The second area was pseudoscience. Now, pseudoscience is interesting because pseudoscience, they just made up stuff when it came to African Americans. So, like, for example, dropmania. And dropmania is the condition of a slave, an African American slave, that he cannot suppress the urge to be free. He suffers from dropmania. Okay? Made up science. But there were worse science because remember they said that the African American was inferior in every way. The African American had a low tolerance for pain. Now, why do you think those laws were, that science was made up, right? When you think about the slave who had to work from sundown to sunup, the slave did not have the sort of soul that soul and love. Well, when you tear a baby from its mother's arm, of course, in order to say that, you have to ignore the cries, or maybe you had the overseer's whip saying you better not say anything while the baby was being torn from his mother and sold off. She just had to groan, grit her teeth. Then you say, well, oh, see, they don't feel for their babies. So we can go on and on about the science, that the genetics, that the African American, the people of color, they have lower IQs, lower genetics. You ever heard of the bell curve? That's today's science, where they say that genetically, black people have lower IQs. That's today's science. But where do you get that from? You go all the way back to this pseudoscience where they just started making up stuff. That is why in the turn of the century, after the Civil War, you ever heard the term the Great White Hope? Well, you know where that term came from? The Great White Hope came from a boxer by the name of Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson would just effortlessly beat all of the white boxers to the point that it infuriated the white people. Because a black person was not supposed to be that superior. The white man was supposed to be physically superior, and he would effortlessly beat them. And they searched out. They would bring in one at a time. Searched out. That's why they called it the Great White Hope, because they were trying to find a white boxer who could beat this black man. In the, I believe it's 1940, 40s World Olympics, the Jesse Owens, who was the fastest man at the time. Remember, he wasn't supposed to be, because the white man was supposed to be superior. Hitler came to these games to see this black man defeated by a white man. And when he wasn't, he stormed out. See, that mentality was always there. The mentality that blacks were inferior. And it carried on even after slavery, carried on into Jim Crow. See, the thing about slavery was that, and one of the interesting things to me is when you look at the founding fathers, right? Some of these founding fathers here, slave owning founding fathers. What is interesting to me is that these men who are supposed to be morally, spiritually, intellectually superior could have the mentality that, okay, blacks were inferior. Okay, right? They bought black people. They went across the Atlantic and bought slaves over. Some of these men, right, not only had slaves, but they slept with them. Oh yeah, right? They slept with them. So when you think about today, why there's so many biracial people, it's because people like this slept with their slaves. And you know, it's amazing. Here's the hypocrisy, that there's no condemnation to these men who at the very least slept with their animals, slept with their property, slept with inferior beings. Where's the condemnation? Where's the moral condemnation for these men? Huh? If you say that they're superior, if they felt, and they did because they owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson really had a low view of African, and yet he slept with Sally. We can go on with all the rest of them, okay? That you would carry out your sexual urges. So, now America did wrestle in their consciousness, but they know they was wrong. They knew slavery was wrong, and they knew it was a stain on them. They just never, a lot of them didn't, it was a hard fought effort to end slavery. And when slavery ended, when they could no longer own human beings, profit from human beings, then they discarded them. They discarded them in what we know as the era of Jim Crow. So we can't profit from them. And now all of a sudden the Negro became lazy, a criminal. Now, while they owned and made profit of them, he was a hard worker. They worked them hard. But when they couldn't, guess what? Jim Crow said, let's segregate from them. Let's keep them separate. Let's keep them away from us. They're no good to us now. And they treated them barbarically. Jim Crow was hard and brutal. And remember that lasted to 1965. So from 1619, and if you know, to 1965, nearly 340 years, something like that. America was a legal, constitutional, racist nation. But how did it get there? Because you had to condition the minds of Americans that African Americans were inferior. You had to condition whites that they were superior. You had to condition blacks that they were inferior. You had to condition the minds. Okay? Condition the minds. So now, as we go into Jim Crow, he said, okay, blacks can't live around us. Blacks can't be equal to us. So then we come to, of course, to 1955, when you had the laws blacks couldn't ride in the same seating area on the buses as blacks in Montgomery, Alabama. There were actual laws that said you had to sit in the back of the bus. And there was a section called the colored section. Blacks would have to get on the front, pay their fare, get off, walk to the back, get on, and sit in the back of the bus. And sometimes, just for spite, the bus driver would just drive off and leave them. What can you do? The government, it was legal to discriminate. And of course, this is when you have Rosa Parks, who sat down in the colored section. Now, here is the thing, though. If the bus was full, even though the black people paid their fare, even though the black people were sitting in their colored section, if the bus was full, they had to give up their seat to a white person. It was the law. Rosa Parks refused, and thus that ignited the civil rights movement. It brought, of course, Martin Luther King to the forefront, and that boycott of riding the buses was one of the first victories of the civil rights. They still didn't like it, because that was 1955, and you still had another 10 years of hard fought when it came to the issues of racism. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick it up in part 2, because we're going to get into the church now. Next, we're going to talk about the church. Oh, yes. So we'll pick it up in part 2. So don't forget to like and share this video, and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome, and I will see you in part 2.